Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the podcast, host Craig Jeffery sits down with Jon Paquette, Senior Financial Solutions Expert at TIS, to discuss bank account management, protecting the doors to your most liquid assets. Topics of discussion center around the essentials for managing bank accounts effectively, the common issues companies are facing today, solutions for cash flow visibility, and more. Listen in to find out how to position your company for success.
Welcome back to the Treasury Update podcast.
Thanks, Craig. Good to be here.
Jon is the VP of Solutions at Treasury Intelligence Solutions, or TIS, and I'm glad to have him back. But before we go into the topic in depth, I'd love to have just a quick review of your career highlights and a little bit of your background and what do you do as the VP of Solutions at TIS?
Yeah, happy to do that. So, I started my career really in the Treasury practitioner space and spent about 15 years working for different companies in different Treasury roles. Most recently, I oversaw Treasury for an $8 billion in revenue healthcare organization. Made the jump over to the technology side back in 2019. That's when I joined TIS, and I'm currently serving as the VP of Solutions for our US market. So in this role, I'm overseeing our customer onboarding team, our solutions architects, and our partner engagement and onboarding functions as well.
As we shift from some of your background into the talking about bank account management, or BAM, as you'll hear me say and hear us talk about a lot, maybe we can begin with what are some of the issues before we get into what goes on with BAM. So maybe you talk about common issues and methods companies are using to manage their bank account processes, bank account data. How does that work, Jon?
Right. Yeah, no, I think some of the classical issues, or kind of the most quintessential issue, is that organizations don't have confidence that their records are actually up to date. There's questions around, did we add that new batch of accounts that we opened last quarter? Did we update our signers for the most recent signatory update? Did we incorporate that legal entity name change? And, I think depending on the solutions companies have in place for bank account management, there's just no way to tell, right? The other issue that we see a lot of companies having is controlling actually who has access to those records. So for most companies, you need to give access to your BAM records to a broad range of people within the organization. There's just a lot of people that use that data beyond just Treasury. And but there's no way to, segregate who has control over what, or, to make sure you're avoiding things like incorrect data changes or accidental changes, people deleting data accidentally within those records. Another issue I think is tracking the documentation that goes along with those bank account records. So one thing is, the repository of bank account information, but then you also want to track your latest and greatest signature cards. So, we see a lot of companies still, tracking those on a shared drive, then accessing that document, not being sure it is even the latest and greatest, or even, believe it or not, in file cabinets. A lot of people are still printing out these documents and storing them in file cabinets as well. And then probably the last one I'll point out here is tracking too little information. So I think there's just an overall lack of sort of guiding into best practices with most BAM solutions. They don't tell you what you should and shouldn't track for the most part. So when you go to leverage them for the purposes that you would for your bank account management records, whether that be like audits, KYC reviews, regulatory filings, you find that you actually don't have all the data points that you need, and you're left kind of hunting around to fill in the gaps there.
One of the things I was sort of expecting you to say was related to like file cabinets. Not just people store them in file cabinets; they're in different file cabinets on different floors. Some in legal, some in Treasury, maybe some in spread out over the globe. And I guess maybe that's part of what what you were saying. They're stored in different places. But Jon, this idea of, you mentioned some people use a shared drive and some use file cabinets. What do you see when people are dropping stuff in a shared drive? Do you find they go back and scan everything that's been historical and index them or stick them into the shared drive, or do they just start at a point and move forward so they have this kind of hybrid environment?
Yeah, I'd say for most companies, it's not possible to go back and scan every single one of those documents in, so you have the full history of signatory changes within those documentations. They typically just start at one particular point in time, both for administrative reasons and because of the reasons that you pointed out. All those, paper-based documents are probably stored in all sorts of different places, file cabinets in different geographies, even in people's, desks. And in most parts, they can't, and in most instances, they can't actually locate, all of those documents to scan them all in.
I liked your point about the access. Too much or too little is a key part. But I want to move to the, why is bank account management important? It seems like it's a necessary evil. But why is it necessary? Why is it essential? As you reflect on that, maybe you can bring up some of those examples you had about the issues. How do some of those issues or limitations spin out into bigger problems? For a variety of reasons. But maybe start with, why is BAM important and essential?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely essential. It's definitely a necessary evil, as you mentioned, and it definitely creates bigger organizational problems if it's not handled efficiently. So you have Treasury, who's always the kind of the gatekeeper of this information, the ones that kind of retain this information, make sure it's up to date. But then the BAM information is kind of used by a lot of different departments within the organization as well for part of their processes. Tax departments, for example, might have to access bank account management records to know certain account information, and the accounting department as well, right? Needs to know what accounts are open, what accounts are closed. Obviously, every single cash account needs to be recorded on the GL, right? So that you have accurate financial records. So inaccurate bank account management records kind of have this ripple effect where you're kind of passing bad information downstream. I think you also see a lot of issues come audit time, right? So all Treasury departments know that you have to provide that complete listing of your open cash accounts, including who are the signers on those accounts, as part of your year-end confirmation process. And it's kind of often a panicky moment for a lot of organizations, not knowing if those signer records are actually up to date and if you're giving accurate information about the complete list of accounts, as well as who are the individuals that actually are able to confirm those accounts. Similarly, I think for FBAR filing time, you kind of have similar issues coming in there where it's difficult to pick out what accounts are actually in scope for FBAR filing, who the signers are on those accounts, and I guess who are the signers at any point during a given year. A lot of BAM records just have the latest and greatest, right? They don't have that version history, but for FBAR filing reasons, you need to be able to track who is a signatory at any point during the year, because those individuals have filing requirements as well. And even, related to FBAR filing, if you have to file for your so-called virtual signers, that's a key data point that a lot of BAM solutions don't really track, right?
Jon, I appreciate that. Your comment about too little information, I think, is really borne out in this FBAR filing question. That idea of who are the signers, and if they're a signer at any point in time in the year, you have to know that. And just because someone was on and someone was off, if you don't have a date aspect, you might have to do additional filings because of the requirement. I think the other piece too on that is there's certain requirements of who would have to file if it's a non-U.S. entity, and I'm trying to be brief here, not specific on the FBAR rules, and the person is a U.S. citizen or a U.S. tax, or someone who pays U.S. taxes has to file taxes, they're considered a signer. And you brought up that third point about the virtual signer, someone acting on their own or in conjunction with someone else who can move funds is considered a signer for purposes of FBAR, even though most of the rest of the Treasury world will say, no, that's not a signer. FinCEN designates it that way. So those are three types of classifications that you could have too little information on. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, exactly. And there's no way to turn back the clocks and then go back and retroactively track that information. So companies definitely end up scurrying to try to scrape together those data points come filing time.
One other thing that seems interesting is when I think about bank account management, there's the process of the signers, the services, the controls, the documentation, all those things that you mentioned. it also seems like there's an aspect of bank account management that you'd like the system to help you make sure you're following your policies. And, policies are, I should have these services on these types of account, debit filtering or blocking or these types of controls or information reporting. How many people view that as part of bank account management now? Is that viewed in a disconnected fashion? I've got my policy, but I don't have to comply with it with what I'm doing with bank account management, or I will need to incorporate those things. So systematically I'm controlling for, to make sure we're following our policy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's starting to get into people's minds now more so. So yeah, I mean, one thing that we do in our product is we provide a lot of workflows and approval parameters for opening new bank accounts, making changes, even making selections about which banks certain accounts are going to be opened at. And for a lot of organizations, that's an eye opener. They haven't really thought about those processes before. Particularly if they're, been managing things really through Excel that doesn't, facilitate any sort of workflow or approval process. There's no way to kind of hard code those controls in there, right, and make sure that they're actually being followed. But we're seeing more and more organizations have that mindset specific to the services, which is an interesting point, though. That point probably comes up even less, I would say. Organizations really realizing, okay, we're opening up a new cash account in this market, we need to have a debit filter in place or a debit block in place on this account as part of our account opening policy. So that's an interesting point, though, for sure. And so I'd say that organizations could definitely pay more attention to that.
Yeah, in the paper world, that's almost impossible, right? But in the automated world, it becomes, like you said, it can become a workflow, or it can become data that's captured that you could report on or track or manage it. And it's fair to say, TIS, and maybe I'm classifying your system, but, we view TIS as a treasury aggregator with a strong visibility component, and also, additional, features and modules, if you will, that include bank account management. So, John, what are people using for BAM? You mentioned paper, but there's also systems. So, what are people using for bank account management if it's not just paper? And how are they going through the mindset or the process of picking the types of solutions that they pick? And I guess one of the questions too may be, who is picking those solutions? Is it always Treasury? Is it accounting sometimes? Is it someone in legal who cares about legal entity activity?
Yep. Yeah, so to take that first point, I'm still surprised by how many organizations seem to be using Excel for bank account management. It's funny, it seems like predominantly when we have these conversations, it's organizations looking to move from Excel to something more automated. And, reasons why, I'd have to think that every company has Excel, right? First of all, it's available to use. Secondly, it provides the ultimate in flexibility, right? So you can track any sort of data element that you want to, your accounts, grouped in any sort of structure that you want to, corresponding sweep relationships, all that type of information. But obviously the issue there is it doesn't provide any sort of version control or auditability, so you never know if those Excel records are actually up to date. And when we talk to companies about why they haven't moved off Excel, it seems to be predominantly because they view the solutions that replace it as being nothing more than Excel in the cloud with a different UI. There's not enough value there, it seems like, for them to move away from the flexibility that Excel provides towards some other solution. And I think that this is really what needs to be pushed for companies, even related to the point that you brought up before about tracking services, right? Tracking your policies and procedures. Treasurers are smart and they need to see the value of a BAM solution to be able to move to it. So something we definitely try to push within organizations as well. And in terms of who's being involved in the decisions for a bank account management tool, I think in our opinion, it's always led by Treasury. It just seems like for most organizations, Treasury is the gatekeeper to the bank relationships, the bank account records. But you are seeing more and more, accounting being brought into those decisions. Tax departments, those that manage legal entity records, for example, are being brought into. If they're really looking for something that can act as both a repository for information, but also a workflow tool organizationally to manage a lot of these tasks. So yeah, we see kind of a broad group involved in those decisions these days.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess we've seen a few times where we work with Treasury and we get into how are they managing bank accounts, and it's they have to use something that legal put in place, which is like usually really well designed for legal entity management. And they added a few fields for bank accounts and a few things like that. But it's like, you can tell this was designed for the lawyer side of the house, not for Treasury. It's, almost non-functional for Treasury. Jon, what are the essentials for managing bank accounts effectively? Whether you use a system like yours or something else, how should we be thinking about managing bank accounts in the most effective manner?
Yeah, I think the essentials are really, solving that classical problem around version control. You have to know the records are up to date, right? That's the most important thing about bank account management. So having that, that tracking of changes, those workflows and approval processes, that auditability, see that the most recent changes have been incorporated into the tool is absolutely critical for moving off Excel towards something more advanced. I think the solutions also have to be holistic. So most companies don't want to just track bank accounts. They want to track bank accounts, signer information at a detailed level for FBAR filing, like we mentioned before, nationalities and things like that. They want to track legal entity level information so they can use that information for KYC reviews and things like that, right? So it needs to cover a lot of different data points that are, associated with bank accounts. I think another thing a lot of companies are pushing for these days is to have something that's more than just a repository of information and actually get some reporting out of it. So, being able to run some reports based on the database to see what your account structure looks like, what banks you're using in certain regions, how many accounts you have in certain currencies. These help a lot, I think, with just sort of having a good grasp of your account structure and identifying inefficiencies. Document retention, like we talked about before, getting away from file cabinets and shared folders and things like that. That's something that, is essential to a BAM solution. And I think, more at a high level, something that helps with this managing of a decentralized process. So, another common issue we see for organizations is they have accounts being opened by different departments across the world, right? Different regional finance teams. And so they're looking for a BAM tool that helps them wrangle that into some respect, right? So that they can receive a request to open a new bank account. They can make decisions centrally about what bank that's open at, right? They can be kind of alerted to what's happening at these regional finance levels and make sure that all the kind of downstream processes, the adding of these accounts to the ERPs or the TMSs or whatever it might be, occurs as well. So that's a critical thing I think most organizations are looking for too.
You had mentioned account validation earlier, and I guess, this idea of you sent a letter to the bank to close an account or to cancel a service or add a service or change a signer. Now, the idea that everything happened as expected, they received the letter, that the letter was routed to the right people who are going to make those changes, that those changes were indeed made and they were made accurately. There's dozens of points of failure that can occur that can keep these things from being synced. What you have in your files or in your BAM system may or may not reflect what is actually at the bank. And it's surprising how inaccurate they are. And I'm getting to a question, but we have some customers who want account validation done every year, an audit of sorts, to make sure that it, they're catching differences. Closed accounts are closed, services were added or deleted, signers are accurate. How important is account validation, and has that changed a bit, become a bit more important, a lot more important, or what's your view on that?
I mean, I think it's really important, to be honest, and a lot of customers are bringing up specifically this point as well that you brought up about just sort of validating that what they have on file matches what the bank's records are, and how difficult that process has been historically. Because, I mean, you're right. You could think that you closed out an account, but then 3 weeks later, maybe a credit comes into that account that, based on the bank's policies, automatically reopens it, and then nobody realizes that the account has been reopened for a 2-year period or something like that. You're paying account maintenance fees on it and things like that. So I think there's a strong emphasis on it. To some extent, BAM solutions can solve it. There's good auditability there. There's the ability to run reports of what you have on file that you can then compare up to the bank's records. You can also run, almost internal audits on your account information, so that different people regionally are verifying account information, that those accounts are open, that the signer records are correct, so you can kind of, spread the responsibility to the individuals responsible. But this is actually one of the things I'd love to see the banks solve via API, just the ability to be able to initiate an API call and pull in all your bank account records and signer records so that you can compare them to a bank tool and just make sure the two match, right? So I know a lot of people talk about EBAM, opening up new bank accounts, changing signers, but just the ability to be able to reference that information, I think could really open up the door to some interesting capabilities for the fintechs.
I like that idea, that validation via APIs. That's awesome. Any final thoughts or conclusions that you want to leave the audience with related to protecting the doors to your most liquid assets, right? Every account represents a point of exposure and a point of cost. Any final thoughts, either emphasis or things maybe you haven't covered yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing we haven't covered yet is that, bank account management is typically thought of as this administrative task, but you can do some pretty advanced things with BAM these days that are actually, somewhat strategic for the organization. For example, bank account management systems that have APIs make it possible to really keep your bank account information, your signer information, legal entity info, in sync across multiple different systems. So, you're using a BAM solution as your central source of truth, but also synchronizing those records to ERPs or treasury management systems, whatever it might be, seamlessly from that one destination, which is a pretty cool thing that you can do these days. Another thing that a lot of organizations are talking about is BAM integrations back to identity management tools, so that you can kind of proactively be identified if you have a signer within your BAM records that actually left the company, right? This prevents a lot of those oh no moments that you might have at year end when you realize your signer records are out of date and the individual isn't even with the company anymore. So you can get pretty automated there as well. And you can really leverage a lot of advantages with BAM by integrating it with other data sources as well. Primarily the systems that generate your bank reporting, that are pulling in your electronic bank reporting from your banks or your payment data. It's possible to get almost automated with your FBAR reporting filings by leveraging these multiple different data elements too. So your bank account management records have your signer records. They know your foreign bank accounts. They know the individuals who had signing authorities at different points during the course of the year. You can then combine that with statement information to pull other FBAR filing variables, such as that maximum account value balance during the course of the year, right? So you have these multiple different data sources, and then if you have a good reporting tool as well, a click of the button, you're combining all these data elements, and you have all your points that you need to really file for FBAR. And I think you can do similar things with risk management too, leveraging your bank account management solution. So you have all the detail you need there in terms of your banking landscape, where your accounts are open, and then you can combine that with data sources that are showing your transactional and balance activity to be able to understand if you're holding high balances at certain banks and their credit rating recently took a dip or something like that, right? So there's the possibility to do all sorts of things like that, leveraging your BAM solution as a data point. So very cool things that are happening with BAM these days.
And before we end the podcast, I wanted to follow up on one of those items. You talked about connecting BAM to identity management tools. Are you talking about connecting to like the HR database for who's active employees, or things like SAML or your federated system, where it's like once they're taken off of the system records, it also validates signers? What are you referring to on the identity management side?
Yeah, exactly. So the systems that are really managing the employees within your organization and what systems they have access to, or even the fact that they are employees at the organizations, creating integrations back with those systems to be able to tell if people left the organizations that are listed somewhere in those bank account records is a thing that's actually possible these days.
Excellent. Jon, thank you so much for your time talking about BAM, protecting the doors to your most liquid assets. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.